Hi all, I'm here today to talk about Peter Singer's landmark essay, All Animals Are Equal. Without this essay, this class probably wouldn't even exist. It really kicked off the animal liberation movement, and it's a fantastic article, has aged really well, and kicked off a whole body of literature and a movement which has been very helpful in to get us to think about how we should be treating non-human animals. So the subtitle of this article is very instructive. So the title being All Animals Are Equal, and the subtitle here being Or Why the Ethical Principle on which Human Equality Rests requires us to extend equal consideration to animals too. So that really outlines the premise of the argument that he's going to be laying out here. So if we're going to extend equality to all human beings, equal moral consideration to all human beings, then consistency demands that we extend equal consideration to non-human animals too. And so he's going to try to support that claim that consistency demands that if we're going to, based on principle, give equal consideration to all human beings, we must extend that principle to non-human animals as well. All right, so let's jump into his argument. Before we do, here's Peter Singer looking dreamy, thinking about how to get resources to those in desperate poverty, or how to get better treatment for beings which deserve it. He's a living philosopher, so you see 1946 through, he's still alive. So one of the cool things about studying living philosophers is you can hear them speak for themselves. So if you're unhappy with my presentation of his work, go find his presentation of his own work. I linked on our Course Canvas site, I linked to a video of Peter Singer appearing on the Colbert Report. Colbert is doing his best sort of devil's advocate for against Singer's position. So you can check that out. It'll give you the basics of his argument. It's a good thing to watch before you read the article, but you should watch that and read the article before you take on this lecture. So Singer starts in an interesting place. He wants to start by talking about why racism and sexism are wrong. So he defines racist and sexist, or a condition of being a racist or a sexist is believing that certain races or sexes are superior in all intellectual and moral capacities. But this is easily proven wrong. If this is what racism and sexism is, then it's easily dispensed with. Because take any race or sex. There are members of that race or sex that are superior in their moral and intellectual capacities to a member of another race or sex. So for anybody who says my race is superior and my race deserves more moral consideration than any other race, you might ask them, well, on what do you base that judgment? Do you base it on some superior capacities that they have? And they might say, yes, my race is the smartest and the most compassionate, or something like that. That's why we deserve more moral consideration. But then it would be easy for anybody to point out, well, look at this member of your race. They're not very intelligent. They're not very compassionate. And look at this member of a different race. They are very intelligent and they are very compassionate. In fact, more so than that member of your race. So that what we might call, what I think Singer calls simple racism, or it would have an analog with simple sexism, is easily dispensed with. It's easy to show why those views are wrong. So, somebody who was going to defend a view that some human beings deserve more moral consideration than others might have a fallback position here. They might say people who have certain IQ scores deserve more moral consideration and rights than other human beings. And note that our defense against racism does not offer us a response against this type of inegalitarianism. So egalitarianism here is just a fancy word for thinking that human beings deserve equal moral consideration. So an inegalitarian would be somebody who thinks that they don't deserve equal consideration, that some human beings deserve more consideration than others. So when we were pointing out that some members of some races are smarter than that, for any race, there's some members that are smarter and some members that are less smart than members of other races. If somebody were to say, well, let's just dispense with race altogether, let's base moral consideration and rights on the capacity itself. So let's base it on IQ. Well, then our defense against racism, it won't apply here. So we're left with a potential problem. If we're going to think that human beings deserve equal consideration, it can't be based on their IQ scores. So there's another fallback position here. For the racist or sexist. Somebody might say different races and sexes might have greater moral or intellectual capacities on average. So therefore, those races or that race or sex might deserve more moral consideration or rights because on average they're more intelligent or more compassionate or something like this. So instead of saying every individual of a race is more intelligent or more compassionate than every member of every other race, this racist would say, on average, if you give IQ scores to everybody and you group them by race, if that were even something that you could do, if race had such a precise definition that you could group them that way, then this sophisticated, in big scare quotes here, racist might say, on average, people of my race will perform better than people of other races. Now, that may be true. In fact, there's been some work done on this, and they find that it's very difficult to group races because there's all sorts of criteria for what makes somebody a member of some race, but there has been some work done on this, and some patterns seem to emerge that some groups of people perform better on IQ tests than other groups of people. So specifically, I believe the work on this has found that Asians and so people of Asian descent and Jewish people perform better on IQ tests on average than the rest of than other similarly grouped people. So somebody might say, well, look, I am Jewish, so therefore I deserve more moral consideration than everybody else because on average my people score better on IQ tests, and if they did a measure, we're more compassionate than other races. Now, the rest of us who would, probably be a little bit offended about that, we could say, look, well, maybe the differences in your test scores versus our test scores are explained by environmental factors, maybe environmental or maybe socioeconomic factors. So maybe education in your culture is more highly valued, and maybe that leads to the difference in IQ test scores. Or maybe it's that there could be a lot of factors here, but we could try to explain away the differences with environmental factors, that it's not an inborn superiority in terms of IQ or moral capacity, but it's the differences are learned, right? But then Singer wants to point out our defense of egalitarianism would hinge upon the results of scientific investigation and analysis. If we want to say, look, we need people's capacities to really be equal, or on average really be equal across different groups, in order for us to be justified in extending moral consideration to these groups, well, then if somebody came along with a really impressive analysis that showed, oh no, these differences actually aren't based on environmental factors, these are inborn capacities, and some groups of human beings have better mental capacities than others, well, then if we were trying to defend egalitarianism and we were trying to base it on capacities, well, then we'd have to just give up the game here, because we'd have to say, well, certain people have better mental capacities than others, so those people deserve more moral consideration. And we don't want to do that. It seems wrong. It seems like some sort of category error is being made here. And that's going to ultimately be Singer's response to this issue. So, what then is the best response to even the sophisticated racist or sexist? Somebody who says, on average, my race or my sex has more intellectual and moral capacities than others, therefore we deserve more moral consideration than other groups. The best response is going to be this, and this is probably the most important quote in the entire paper. The principle of equality is not a description of an alleged actual equality among humans. So it's not a statement about we're all equally smart, or we're all equally strong, or average out take all our capacities together, we're somehow equally valuable in terms of our capacities. It's rather a prescription of how we should treat human beings. So when we're saying people deserve equal moral consideration, we're not saying that based on whatever they have to offer. We're prescribing the way we should treat them, right? So just because some people have a higher IQ or more developed moral capacities than others, that does not mean that they thereby gain the right to exploit other people, the dumb, the less intelligent, for their own purposes. That's not the way we think that human beings should be treated. We should take care to consider the interests of all beings that have interests. So all people that have interests, certainly. So human beings come in all sorts of different suites of capacities. Some are stronger, some are weaker, some are more intelligent, some are less intelligent. Some people have more of all of those capacities, some people have less of all those capacities, but the claim from the moral standpoint is they deserve equal moral consideration regardless of their capacities. And why is that? Well, Singer will take a utilitarian line here. He'll say we deserve equal moral consideration because we can all suffer and we can all enjoy. So on the basis of that, on the basis of having things that can go better or worse for us, what makes us deserve equal consideration. So where does he think we should draw the line between beings which deserve our moral consideration and beings which do not, who do not deserve our moral consideration? He's going to follow a utilitarian line here. So Singer is a contemporary utilitarian moral philosopher. So that's how he's going to carve up the joints of the moral community. We should consider the interests of any being that can have interests. The capacity for suffering and enjoyment is a prerequisite for having interests at all. So any being that can suffer and can enjoy life, they automatically thereby have an interest. If a being can suffer, they have an interest in not suffering. If a being can enjoy their lives, then they have an interest in enjoyment, in experiencing pleasure. So, in the Colbert interview, Colbert accuses Singer of, aren't you being animalist? And he says, well, you might say sentientist, that he believes that sentient creatures, so beings that can sense being the root word of sentient, beings that can feel suffering, that can feel joy, or pleasure. Let's put the word pleasure there. It's simpler. They deserve our moral consideration, and that's a shorthand explanation of who's in the moral community. So all sentient beings deserve our moral consideration. Everything else does not get moral consideration on Singer's view. So the way Singer views the historical progress of the moral community is as an ever-expanding circle, or up to this point, expanding circle. So initially, and unfortunately you still do have today, but hopefully fewer than before, you'd hear people say things like, only my race or my sex, we're the only things that deserve moral consideration, and nothing else deserves moral consideration. You might have a bigger scope of the moral community where somebody might say, only people with high IQs, whatever high might mean here, deserves moral consideration. Everything else doesn't. Somebody might be even more inclusive, and they might say all and only human beings deserve moral consideration, and nothing else deserves moral consideration, or at least deserves less moral consideration. And then you get what Singer's view is. So note these groups, the group that's in the category of beings that deserve moral consideration is growing. Here he'll say all sentient beings. So every being that can feel pleasure and pain, they're in the moral community. Everything that can't is out of the moral community. Now, one thing to note here, where would common sense fall in this hierarchy? Well, the sense that is common, at least here in the US, is that all human beings deserve moral consideration, and then some animals deserve some moral consideration depending on their intellectual capacities, depending on how much they're like us. And the further they get away from us, the less moral consideration they deserve. And then there's some super weird views like cows and pigs and chickens deserve hardly any moral consideration, while dogs and cats and horses deserve a lot of moral consideration. Maybe dolphins and whales deserve moral consideration, but other fish don't, other sea creatures, I should say here, don't deserve much moral consideration. Common sense here is all over the board. It's not based on any sort of principle. So, how can we sum up Singer's argument here before we get to the consequences of his view for the way we should be treating animals? Singer wants to say, if we want to hold the belief that all human beings deserve equal moral consideration, then we're going to have to base that on some principle. Well, there's no capacity that all human beings have equally. And So if we're going to say that all human beings deserve equal consideration, let me revise this a little. There is one capacity that human beings share, and that's the ability to feel pleasure and pain. So if we're going to extend equal moral consideration to all human beings, and we're going to base it on some capacity that they all have, then it's going to have to be on the capacity to just feel pleasure and pain. Because any other capacity that we might try to pin on all of humanity won't get all of humanity. Now, if we're going to base equal moral consideration on that capacity, then it's going to, of course, extend beyond just human beings and extend well into the animal kingdom. So the principle, again, going back to his subtitle, the ethical principle on which human equality rests requires us to extend equal consideration to animals too. So the ethical principle is that any being which can experience pleasure and pain deserves equal moral consideration. That's going to require us to extend equal consideration to animals too. Now, let me talk a little bit about what equal consideration means. So equal moral consideration does not require equal treatment. Singer points out, pigs don't have an interest in voting, so they don't need the same access to voting booths that human beings do. They do, however, have an interest in walking about freely, playing in the mud, not being separated from their families, not being killed, possibly, at least not suffering. So we should consider these interests in our moral decision-making and our moral judgments. So even if we were going to give a pig equal moral consideration to the human being, that just means we should allow them, we should be just as concerned with their ability to walk about freely, to play, to not be separated from their families. We should take those interests just as seriously as we take those similar interests in human beings. We don't need to be concerned with the pig's right to vote because it has no interest in voting. We do need to be concerned with human beings' ability to vote, so we should allow them to vote by mail and such. But we don't need to do that with pigs. So equal consideration does not mean equal treatment. And then there are some... there are all sorts of interesting cases we could talk about here. Singer's position as a utilitarian is that pain is pain and pleasure is pleasure. It doesn't matter what type of being is experiencing the pleasure and pain. What Singer is interested in doing is maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain, creating the world where there's the greatest balance of pleasure over pain. And that is it doesn't matter what type of beings we're talking about. So we need to consider the interests of all these creatures and the mental states of these creatures equally in our calculus. All right, so let's talk about some consequences of his view. What kind of changes to our practices would Singer's view entail? He answers this when he's answering an objection on page 709 here. So he says, it may be objected that these comparisons of the sufferings of different species are impossible to make, and that for this reason, when the interests of animals and humans clash, the principle of equality gives no guidance. It is probably true that comparisons of suffering between members of different species cannot be made precisely, but precision is not essential. Even if we were to prevent the infliction of suffering on animals only when it is quite certain that the interests of humans will not be affected to anything like the extent that the animals are affected, we would be forced to make radical changes in our treatment of animals that would involve our diet. Think about the farming methods we use, so think about factory farming practices especially, but not just factory farming practices. It would influence the way we farm animals in other ways. Experimental procedures in many fields of science, our approach to wildlife and to hunting, trapping, and the wearing of furs, and areas of entertainment like circuses, rodeos, and zoos. As a result, a vast amount of suffering would be avoided. Now, one thing to note, Singer is a utilitarian ultimately, so he's going to say that ultimately what we're trying to do is maximize the balance of pleasure over pain, create a world that's the most happy. So he won't be in principle against eating animals. He won't be in principle against experimenting on animals. He won't be in principle against hunting. He won't be in principle against trapping and the wearing of furs. He might be not in principle against it, but because it always comes along with more suffering than enjoyment. But areas of entertainment like circuses, rodeos, and zoos, so he won't be in principle against using animals for entertainment, even if it causes them some suffering. Because what he's going to look at is the entire practice. Would the world be better without these practices, or would it be better with these practices? Or if he's looking at experiments, would the world be a better place if this experiment was done or if this experiment wasn't done? Now, to figure that out, we'll have to weigh all of the pleasure that comes out of the practice and all of the suffering that's avoided, or all of the suffering that comes out of the practice and all the pleasure that's avoided. We have to weigh all of that in our decision. So looking at an individual experiment that was performed on animals, we'd have to consider the suffering that is caused to the animals in the experiment, the suffering that the humans doing the experiment might experience from seeing the animals suffer. Then we'd have to think about what potential long-term benefits there were, how likely those long-term benefits would be, how much suffering would be likely to be prevented, or how much pleasure would be likely to be created. And we'd have to look at the experiment through that sort of lens. And we might find that some are worth doing, some are not worth doing. We might find, when looking at the ways we farm animals for food, that some practices cause net more suffering than others. We'd certainly find that. And some we'd find cause more pleasure than others. We'd have to think about all of the individual practices and what they should look like, right? So it would be a very nuanced conclusion that that we would have to draw. Finally, and this is important, Singer wants to make the case that equal consideration in an end to speciesism does not entail that lives are of equal value. Those things being true, or those things, if we should extend equal consideration to animals, and if we were going to end speciesism, they would entail that we can't mark the difference in value of a life based on species membership. So we can't say just because somebody is a member of the species Homo sapiens that their life is more valuable than a member of another species, because it might not be the case. And Singer here is not one to pull his punches. He is going to say that there are some animal lives that are more valuable than some human lives. And when might that be the case? Well, you can imagine an adult chimpanzee is, we'll talk about that in a little bit. The important point here is there are non-speciesist reasons to value mentally functioning adult human lives more than animal lives. So let's get to this point. So I'm going to read a pretty significant section here because it's important for his view. I conclude then that a rejection of speciesism does not imply that all lives are of equal worth, while self-awareness, the capacity to think ahead and have hopes and aspirations for the future, the capacity for meaningful relationships with others, and so on, are not relevant to the question of inflicting pain. Again, pain is pain. Whatever other capacity is beyond the capacity to feel pain the being might have. So if we're thinking about inflicting pain, or thinking about bringing enjoyment. We should be completely indifferent when it comes to what species is feeling the pain, what species the being is that is feeling the pain or feeling the pleasure. But those other additional capacities, note they're ones that human beings have, are relevant to the question of taking life. It is not arbitrary to hold that the life of a self-aware being capable of abstract thought, of planning for the future, of complex acts of communication, and so on, is more valuable than the life of a being without these capacities. To see the difference between the issues of inflicting pain and taking life, consider how we would choose within our own species. If we had to choose to save the life of a normal human being or an intellectually disabled human being, we would probably choose to save the life of a normal human being. Now think here of severely mentally disabled. So in the ethics class, in the introduction to ethics class, we talk about babies that are anencephalic, so babies that are born without brains. If we had to choose between the lives, if only one could live, and we were to choose between an anencephalic baby without a brain or a child with full mental capacities, it seems that we would prefer to extend the life of the child with normal mental capacities. So let's follow up again here. We would probably choose to save the life of a normal human being, but if we had to choose between preventing pain in the normal human being or the intellectually disabled one, imagine that both have received painful but superficial injuries, and we only have enough painkiller for one of them. It is not so clear how we ought to choose. In fact, we might be more inclined to choose to give the painkiller to the intellectually disabled one. Don't think of anencephalic here because it's not clear. They can feel pleasure and pain, but more minor mental disabilities. We might choose to give them the painkiller. Why? Because it might be difficult to explain to them that the pain is only temporary, that it was going to end, that it wasn't going to cause any lasting damage. Well, we could explain that to the child without the mental disability there. So in that case, we might actually prefer to give it to the child with the mental disability. The same is true, he says, when we consider other species. The evil of pain is in itself unaffected by other characteristics of the being who feels the pain. The value of life is affected by these other characteristics. To give just one reason for this difference, to take the life of a being who has been hoping, planning, and working for some future goal is to deprive that being of the fulfillment of those efforts. To take the life of a being with a mental capacity below the level needed to grasp that one is a being with a future, much less make plans for the future, cannot involve this particular kind of loss. So why in general should we prefer the life of a human? If we had to choose, should we prefer to extend the life of a human being as opposed to a non-human animal? Well, take human beings who are fully mentally developed. Those human beings have plans for their future. They think of their lives in terms of an ongoing story. They have hopes for their future. They have plans for the future, and they're working towards goals for the future. If you take that life away, you frustrate those plans. So that's a loss for them. Whereas if you kill a non-human animal, it's not clear that they have those sorts of goals. I don't think our household pets are sitting around thinking things like, oh, I need to patch up my relationship with Johnny. We've grown apart. I really need to work on this. And if we killed them, they'd be like, oh, I never got to patch up that relationship, right? Not clear that they're thinking that. So Singer wants to say here that even if we adopt equal moral consideration for human beings and non-human animals, that doesn't mean that their lives are equally valuable. It just means that when it comes to causing them pain or causing them pleasure, we should be indifferent as to the pleasure or pain as to whether we're causing that pleasure or pain to a human being or a non-human animal. But if we're forced to take one of their lives, we have non-speciesist reasons for preferring to extend the human life as opposed to the non-human animal life. So normally, this will mean that if we have to choose between the life of a human being and the life of another animal, we should choose to save the life of a human. But there may be special cases in which the reverse holds true because the human being in question does not have the capacities of a normal human being. So this view is not speciesist, although it may appear to be at first glance. Now, I'm fairly convinced by that reasoning that it's based on an analysis of the capacities that individuals have, quite apart from what species they might be a member of. So the value of a life depends on more than just the ability to feel pleasure or pain. It depends on other preferences that a being might be capable of having. However, we can still say that animals deserve equal moral consideration, especially when it comes to causing them pain or causing them pleasure. Though, when it comes to that, they go equally in our moral calculus. So, hopefully that helped. For this week, you're assigned to write a micropaper on Singer's argument. So in the first paragraph, see if you can sum up his argument. You should include in your summary an explanation of his subtitle to the paper, why the ethical principle on which human equality rests requires us to extend equal consideration to animals too. You should probably include that quote about that says that human equality is not a description but a prescription. That's a really key piece of his argument here. After explaining his argument, you're going to have to come up with an objection to his argument. He floats some objections in here. You might use one of those, and then you'll have to respond to the objection on his behalf. So your objection could be one that he considers, or it could be one of your own objections. Either way, you'll have to present an objection and respond to it on Singer's behalf. So good luck with that micropaper. I look forward to reading your thoughts, and I'll see you next time.